is John chapter 6 and verses 1 to 15.
So, John chapter 6, beginning at verse 1. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a great multitude followed him, because they saw his miracles which he did on them that were diseased. And Jesus went up into a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. And the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh. When Jesus then lifted up his eyes and saw a great company come unto him, he said unto Philip, When shall we buy bread that these may eat? And this he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said unto him, There is a lad here which hath 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes. But what are these among so many? And Jesus said, Make the men sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples that were sat down, and likewise of the fishes as much as they would. When they were filled, he said unto the disciples, Gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. Therefore they gathered them together, and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves which remained over and above them that had eaten. Then these men, when they had seen the miracle that Jesus did, said, This is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world. When Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him a king, he departed again into a mountain himself alone.
Well, we're continuing in the Gospel of John with different people that the Lord met. And this one's a little bit different because it's one amongst many that he meets on this occasion in chapter 6 that Phil Barkley kindly took for us in the reading. And I've just entitled it, What Can I Give Him? What Can I Give Him? And for about 10 days now I've been singing. I've actually managed to sing the last verse of In the Bleak Midwinter. And when I say I've actually managed, I've never been able to sing it because it's funny, it's not what can I give him at the end, and the last verse is what I give him. And I've never been able to squeeze the words in, albeit only I. But I've been singing it to myself for about 10 days now, but there we are. He crosses the Sea of Galilee, the Lord, and we know that he crosses for a purpose. We found this in a number of sermons that we've looked at over recent days, that there's a great purpose to his life. But there does seem to be around about 3 different things that are linked in to his crossing the Sea of Galilee. The first one, Matthew tells us that John's martyrdom, John the Baptist's martyrdom, Jesus had heard news of John being martyred in the prison. He'd been beheaded. And it says Jesus then crossed the Sea of Galilee. And it implies that he moved. Galilee was the place where Herod, who was the tetrarch of Galilee, he moved across the Sea of Galilee over the other side to, I suppose, an area that we call Penyrheol. It's okay if she comes up, that's fine, there's no problem at all. And so we find it with David when Samuel was laid to rest. As soon as Samuel passed away, David went down into the wilderness. He didn't want to be around where Samuel had once been. He moved away, and whether there's elements there in David's heart of best to get out of the way now, Saul might feel a bit too confident and come after me. So he goes down into the wilderness just to hide away, for want of a better thing. I don't know whether the Lord was thinking like that, but it does seem a coincidence, doesn't it, that on the time that he hears news of John's martyrdom, he moves and gets in a boat and sails across to Galilee. There's another thing that really one or two of the other gospel writers, they pick up. The 12 disciples had returned from their first preaching tour. It would seem that they returned, or they went out without the Lord, without him being with them. They went out and preached and prayed for the sick and all the different things, and they came back. It's quite clear they came back absolutely drained. They were shattered. Do you know, I can remember when I first preached, I remember Barry Tyler saying to me, I booked you in to preach up in Aberdare. And I went up there and I preached, I remember that. And I came back, do you know, the next night, Monday night, I was in bed by 8 o'clock. I was absolutely blown out. I used to pour with sweat. I'd be shouting and preaching and all my arm actions and everything. Of course, I've become a lot more refined now, but almost every Sunday, if I preached the next night, Judith will tell you I'd be in bed by about 8 o'clock. I'd be flat out, absolutely drained. Well, they came from this first preaching tour, and the Lord said to them, they come aside and rest a while. And then this is everything that John mentions that the others don't mention. He said it's getting towards Passover. And so people over 3 days from the north of the country would journey down towards Jerusalem, about 15 miles a day or whatever it is. They'd journey down, and they, as we mentioned earlier, they would cross the Jordan, some of them, but some would come across the top end of Galilee and then make their way down. So there seems to be three things ongoing that affected Jesus going across into Galilee, across Galilee into this area that we call, I suppose, Penyrheol. He went for those three reasons, it seems, or three reasons that are linked to his travelling across. Why would he go across for the people that are going down for Passover? He could speak with them along the way. He liked to just travel down with people. We tend to think of Jesus being very, very, I don't know, is it formal? Formal would be the word, isn't it, you know? But he was very relaxed with people. Loved to sit down and talk with people over the dinner table. When he's talking or when he's walking, he's talking with them. John 17, if we read it correctly, he's not in the garden, he's walking. He's walking. He's not in the garden at all. He gets to the garden and he's finished praying that prayer in John 17. He's walking and talking to the Lord. Because in John 15, I think it says towards the end, or John 16, let us rise and be going. So they've left the premises. And he's walking and talking to the Lord at the same time. He's very, very informal. Someone very, very relaxed. So these three things, they seem to mount together. And we read this concerning his words to the disciples in Mark chapter 6. It says this, come aside, rest a while, to a deserted place. I'm going to have to put my glasses on. They're terrible to do. Dorothy was boasting about her eyesight. But, come aside and rest a while to a deserted place. For many had been coming and going, and they did not have time even to eat. They just didn't even have time to eat at all. It was that time. Mark gives that impression sometimes. For the Lord to catch up on some sleep, he falls asleep in a boat. That's the way he would catch up on sleep sometimes. And here we find that when they returned, there was so much coming and going. Do you know when the Lord really moves in people's lives? There are times that it's not time to eat even. That's an astonishing thing, isn't it? When you think how much we love our food, when you stop and think about it, that the work of God can take you so much that, and some men, I suppose, and some women have suffered the consequences for it sometimes. They've overstrained their frame, their physical body. But they're toing and froing of the people, coming and talking, asking questions, asking if they can meet these particular needs. There wasn't even time to eat. So he said, look, let's cross over. We'll go to a quiet place, a solitary place, and there we'll rest a while. So we just find in verse 33 of the same chapter, many saw him departing by boat, and when they saw him and knew him, they ran on foot from all the cities, and they arrived before he came to land. Now it sounds a bit funny, they've outsped him. But if you look where he sailed from and where he sailed to, you could see that it's just that little horn at the top of Galilee. And he's sailing across and they're running on foot. It's almost like a comical situation, isn't it, you know? The numbers are gathering. They saw him and they realized who it was. And all they were saying is this: we want to be where he is. And so they made their way. And they actually get there before him. There can be an eagerness within the heart that you can get to church before I get here to open up. One of the lovely things in the early revivals of the early 1900s was this, is that they would have meetings on the steps of the church outside. They'd have the meetings on the steps of the church, waiting for them to come up and open up. And some people got so disgruntled with it that they put chains on the doors to stop people coming in. You can't believe. Isn't religion a funny thing sometimes? The way we approach it sometimes. The way, if you don't do it like the way I do it, then that's it. And you find people that were so taken up with the Lord, they were coming to church early. And people were upset about that. You're going to church too early. You're going to put a chain on the door. And so they had to actually move buildings. What a sad story to tell. You can be so eager for the Lord that you want to get there even before he does. Now, we know today he's going to be here before you, don't we? We know that. His presence would be here before you. But it's a lovely, simple way of looking at eagerness within the heart, of getting there. And so we find with this, that they make their way towards the other side. They pass the nearest city or village that we would call it would be Bethsaida, which is where Philip, Peter, and Andrew are from. And it's surprising, but it's not surprising really, that the two people that get involved in the conversation after are two people that comes from Bethsaida, that know the lay of the land, that know the individuals, that know the dwellers in that particular city or village. Let's have a little look. Verse 34 says this: when Jesus came out of the boat, he saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them, for they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he sat down and he taught them. They were like sheep without a shepherd. The great prophet John, that would have been labouring just a little bit down from this area here at the foot of Galilee, the great prophet John had now been martyred. They had no voice to speak to them. John had a wonderful ministry. He could speak to Pharisees and to the leaders of the religion of Judaism quite eloquently. He could hold his own in their company quite easily, and he would preach to them. Then the common people, the ordinary people, would ask him. After the Sadducees and Pharisees had asked him a question, they too would ask him a question. What shall we do, they said. And on the same occasion then, there were actual soldiers there. Whether they were members of Herod's guard or whether they were Roman soldiers, I'm not quite sure. But we find that they too called to John in the middle of his sermon, what shall we do then? Now that prophet had been taken away. Imagine what that's like. To have a man of whom Jesus said there has not been a prophet like this man before, with the message that he's got. He's the greatest of all the prophets. And he's gone. But the wonderful thing about Christianity is this, is that the world goes on. I told you before, didn't I, when I left BT, how will we cope without you? You're the heart of the office, calling across from here to there. As soon as I left, share price went up. And all the different things that goes on in those situations. We tend to think that the world revolves around us and it'll never be the same. It won't be the same. But the world still goes on. It still goes on. It doesn't stop for anyone. We wish it would sometimes. We wish Not to, let's stop the world so I can get off. Let's stop the world that people would stay with us. There are those occasions when we have that. But here he looks up and he sees the multitude coming towards him. I don't know whether this is another multitude, maybe a crowd of the Galileans that's making their way across the top of the lake to make their way down towards Jerusalem. I don't know. But when he sees them, he has compassion on them. He doesn't feel frustrated. Think of him now. Let's come aside and rest a while. Let's come aside and rest a while. You know, if you were to give me a phone call 7:30 in the morning when this farming life is on, there'd be trouble. It's so relaxing when you watch it. It's actually finished now, so you can ring me 7:30 if you want. But so that's fine. But we settle in our minds, well, it'll be nice now, just to have a sit down and a rest. And this multitude comes along. And he looks at them and he doesn't go into mumble mode. He doesn't, bite his lip. He looks at them and he feels so sorry for them. Great compassion towards them. Sheep without a shepherd. And it says he sat down and taught them. And so his words were to hold them there for that day. This is where we pick up with this year, that he sat down and taught them. And we find that he holds them there for that day. Later on another occasion in the wilderness, he holds them for 3 days. Bible teaching. 3 days. No shop. No cafe bar or whatever, nothing like that. 3 days he holds them. And he feeds the 4,000 men on that occasion, but for 3 days he holds them there. Later on in the Gospel of Luke, when he's down in Jerusalem, it says, and the people were very attentive. It means this, they hung on him. They hung on every word that he spoke. Even his enemies came back and said, we've never heard a bloke speak like this before. Not about the way he talks. It's not... Well, I've often wondered what his voice would have been like. But it's not, the emphasis is not about the accent, I wouldn't have thought. It's about the content. They hang on his words. Ignorant people, intelligent people, people of all strata of society would go and literally hang on him just to listen to him. A marvelous thing that is, isn't it? Wouldn't you like to be in a situation like that? Where someone can just open it up, but it's not just something new, because he wouldn't just talk about something new all the time, but he could throw light on things, most certainly. Well, he sits down and teaches them. And this is where we pick it up with John. John chapter 6, verses 5 and 6. Jesus, knowing what he would do. John loves to tell us about these type of situations. Knowing what he would do, he knew Nathanael before he met him. He knew him, was able to speak to him and tell him that he knew him before he'd ever met him before. He knew Simon, the son of Jonah, Andrew's brother, without ever meeting him before. He told him his name, told him who his father was. And then we read concerning the woman of Samaria, that he goes into Samaria and he meets a woman and tells her all that she has done. He knows. He knew what he was going to do. And so we find him now in this situation that we read of this. He knew what he would do, and so he asked Philip, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? Testing him. Philip replied, for everyone to have a little, as much as 200 denarii of bread is needed. He tests Philip. He knows what he's going to do. So that would mean he knows where the source of food is going to come from. He knows what he's going to do. But he tests Philip, not to be clever with him, but sometimes we can just pass wonderful things by, can't we? Is it Len McGee? Cows and sheep could not sleep. on that starry night. But all the world slept on, I think is the end of that particular verse. The world missed it, but cows and sheep, they were wide awake on that starry night in Bethlehem. And we can miss some gems sometimes, some little gems where God opens to us. And so he speaks to Philip. And Philip, he comes back and he says, well, looking at the numbers here, it'd take at least 200 denarii of bread. Now, how much 200 denarii of bread is, I could have looked up, but I didn't look up. But it would have been a fair whack, I would have thought, for an individual to have. 200 to have a little. For everyone to have a little. John is quite clear to point that out. Just to touch the edge of it, just a little. And so we find then, in these verses here, Andrew, now Philip and Andrew very often work in tandem. And you always find with Andrew that he's bringing people to the Lord. He brought his brother, Peter, to the Lord. He said, we've found the Messiah, come and see him. And then on another occasion, in those, when Philip and Andrew are together, those Greeks go up to the temple, and it's the Greeks that go to Philip and to Andrew, and they speak of them to the Lord Jesus. He wants to introduce them, and now he introduces this boy. It says, Andrew said to Jesus, there is a lad here having 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are these among so many? Barley loaf, or barley bread, was the bread of the poor. Wasn't it really the most substantial of things, but it was the best to be prepared for the poor, for what they could afford. And the fish would have been about the size of a sardine. They tell me in Galilee, maybe Paul and Anita could confirm it for us, but in Galilee, at least at this time, there were masses of fish that would swim up and down the lake, very similar to like a sardine. And this barley loaf, like yesterday we had the birthday celebrations for Izzy down in Penyrheol, and they had her favourite bread, tiger bread or tiger loaf, is it? A huge thing. You know, I don't know what Ellie did with it when she cut it, because it went from being like that, to being like almost like a pancake when she finished with it with a knife. But it wasn't a Swansea loaf. Remember the Swansea loaf? Yeah. It was about the size of a bat, about the thickness of your thumb. 5 barley loaves, and John says 2 small fish. And Andrew says, we've got this lad here, and he's got 5 barley loaves, 2 small fish. But then he asks the question, Andrew now, but what are these among so many? But Jesus knew what he was going to do. And so we have this situation developing. What are they among so many? Just 5 barley loaves, 2 small fishes. With the woman with the 2 mites, what are they among so many? The Jews at that time in the treasury, it was almost like a serpentine thing. That can you remember, Margaret, when we first started putting money in the green box? Or if we did have a green box for Vision of Hope, and you put your money in, it went like this. I'll do it now. Hopefully I won't lose this pound. But it was almost like this, right? You're supposed to do everything in secret. Everybody could hear it dropping. Actually, Margaret came up with this brilliant idea. Why didn't we just put a tissue at the bottom? Well, I never thought of that. But it works a treat. Now people don't know if you put, how much you're putting in type of thing, if it's coinage. But when you used to put the coinage in for the treasury, it would almost rattle on the way down. So everybody knew how much you were giving. Ooh, it's a fair whack. And then this lady come along just around the back end of the treasury, and she puts in these 2 mites, tinkle, 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 down into the bottom. Jesus scanned and watched, and he said, what this woman has put in, she's put in everything she had. And that's worth far, far more than what you put in. We find also with the woman in Simon's house. You remember the woman in Simon the leper's house? It would suggest that the Lord had healed him. He was once a leper, but once you're tarred with something, sometimes the name sticks with you, doesn't it? You find that with some nicknames. They stay with them right through their life. Simon the leper. And Simon is watching this woman. And what seems to be of no merit at all, her tears, her washing, her caressing the feet of Jesus and all those things, anointing him and all those different things, they carry no weight at all. But Jesus said, but what she's done, she's given me all her love. This boy had given all he had. This woman had given everything that she had. And that woman in Simon's house, she had given all the love that she could give. Demonstrated there in that house. And so we find with this. This verse, what are these among so many, has been such a blessing to many a servant of God over the years. What the world has looked at with no merit in it at all, they've looked at it through their eyes. And they can't see what good, what it will achieve, what can be done with such a gift as this. But in the hand of the Master, it can feed a multitude. And you go through some biographies sometimes, and you hear of a woman perhaps who's been called of God. She's the wrong colour skin, she's got the wrong colour complexion, the wrong colour hair. They said the same of Hudson Taylor. You've got fair hair, you've got fair eyes, you've got fair complexion. You won't last 2 minutes in China. And yet, he became the finest missionary probably that Britain ever produced. And we find with others that were called of God and yet seem to have nothing to offer. And yet in the Lord's hands, what is this among so many? A multitude can be fed. And so we find with this boy that he gives these 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And in the giving of 5 loaves and 2 fishes, a miracle takes place. There are not many times in the Gospels where a single occasion is recorded by all 4 Gospel writers. This is one of them. Both Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John record this instance there in the other side of Galilee, where Jesus is feeding the 5,000 men, probably all told, about 10,000 people all told, if we include wives and if we include children. Which makes it even more. It makes me laugh sometimes when we hear of the people being denied that the crossing of the Red Sea was a miracle, that they went through a marsh area. Well, it's incredible that they can get across the marsh area, but what's been more incredible, how do you destroy an Egyptian army in a marsh? Without turning on them and fighting them? They're just on the move, running away from them. So that's an even greater miracle. And here we have this instance here where this boy is given this gift. And so we find that the Lord is able to feed a multitude from him. Matthew 14 brings this up. It says, Jesus took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he looked up there. We talked about that this morning, didn't we? He could be in conversation with you, and then suddenly, before you know it, he's praying. And he wouldn't be. He just simply move on into this, and he takes these 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and he looks up towards heaven, and then it says this, and he blessed them. Do you know what that means? He spoke well of them. With a smile on his face, he says, Lord, I got 5 loaves and 2 fishes by here. What are we going to do with it? He spoke well of them. John says he gave thanks. Just simply gave thanks. But he spoke well of it. Sometimes you can make an appeal. Churches have done it down through the years. I'd be up front with you, I don't think it's happened here. But I've come across situations where appeal has been made for this, that and the other, and what has come through has been disappointing for those that have made the appeal. And that's never happened here as far as I'm concerned. But here we have the Master himself, with 5 barley loaves, thumb thickness, about the size of a bap, and 2 small fish, about the size of sardines. And he just speaks so well of them. Marvellous what the Lord can say. If we could just look through his eyes, not our eyes, and think, well, what are these amongst so many? What's the point of them? We need 200 denarii worth of bread before we can even touch each and every one, for everyone to have a crumb of some sort. Well, it says he gave thanks, he blessed them, and he broke them. That sometimes happens to those that are in the hands of Christ. It's not always comfortable, say. We had a text earlier today where it says, how was it phrased? God does not reveal the future, but he reveals himself. That came from a hand of a woman who's terminally ill. Doesn't know what tomorrow makes. But she knows that in the midst of it all, Christ can be so real. Oh, it'd be lovely if we could have a religion like that every day of our lives, wouldn't it? That we would content ourselves with the Lord. And so we find with this that he broke the bread. When you're in the hand of God sometimes, he has to break us. Has to humble us sometimes. It's not comfortable. It's not easy. I have to be careful how I say it, but I put myself against others and I haven't been broken like they've been broken. I have to be careful with that, and I'm not brandishing that around as thing, but I've seen people broken. And you see them coming out with a strength that is divine strength. Yes. You see them having a ministry that's a divine ministry. It's a God-given ministry. But they'll tell you of times that they were broken. Where they felt as if God's hand applied pressure to them. He blessed them. He broke them. He gave them. Able to share. Rarely kept it to himself. If you notice when Carol read that prayer, the Lord's Prayer this morning, did you notice 2 little pronouns don't appear in it? I and my. They're not in it. It's either him, but in relation to the I and my, it's us or we. Why shouldn't we pray my Father? It's our Father. We're not to be egocentric in our prayers. But there are times when by the grace of God we can turn around and say, Lord, bless me. Just like Jabez did in the Old Testament. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's that way in which it opens up to us. And here, he broke them, he gave them to eat. Earlier we said that 200 denarii, just for everyone to have a bit. Verse 6 or verse 20 says this, they all ate and were filled. They were filled. And there were 12 baskets full left over as well, because the Lord sent them out to pick up all the bits and pieces of bread. As he's breaking, it's a miracle, see. As he's breaking, there's more bread appearing all the time. He breaks off a piece of the loaf and another piece is there. Breaks off a piece of fish and another piece is there. It's amazing what God can do when you're in his hands. Amazing what he can do when you're in his hands. And so we find concerning this that they all ate and were filled. In closing, shall I try and sing it to you? Judith is going, no. What can I give him, poor as I am? If I were a shepherd, I would give a lamb. If I were a wise man, I would What will you give him today? 5 small loaves with 2 fishes? That's all he had. Will you give him your heart today? Will you give him your time today? Will you give him your life today? What I give him. Give him my heart. Not so bad after when I sang it, was it you? There we are.